It is a fine summer day, just past lunchtime, and a man is out enjoying one of his daily jogs. Given the otherwise crappy state of his hometown's unkempt streets, he has recently decided to change up his route, preferring now to run along the bay. But on this particular day, he feels compelled to go a bit further than usual, and he decides to finish his workout by running the length of the Golden Gate Bridge. When the man is about halfway across the bridge, he notices a figure standing on the other side of the railing, looking as if he is about to jump. Concerned for the man's life, the jogger calls out to him. The man on the edge of the bridge turns his head to look at the jogger, then back, refusing to acknowledge the jogger, who then proceeds to approach the railing. "What are you doing?" the jogger asks the man. "I have nothing left to live for," he replies. "All my life I've dedicated myself to trying to improve this crappy world we live in, to do whatever I can to make a positive impact on the world. Donating to charity, humanitarian work, mission trips, you name it. Hell, I've even tried political activism. And no matter what I do, how hard I try, the world seems to be getting worse and worse." "Political activism, you say?" the jogger asks, intrigued, as he himself climbs the railing and takes a seat on the edge of the bridge, dangling his feet over the side. The black-pilled gentleman answers only with a slow, sad nod, and then takes a seat beside the jogger, who then asks, "Tell me, are you a capitalist or a socialist?" "I'm a capitalist," the doomer replies. "Me too. Are you a Democrat or a Republican or neither?" "Neither. I'm an independent." "Me too. Would you describe your politics as being more left-leaning, right-leaning, or libertarian?" "I'm a libertarian." "Wow, me too. Which libertarian politician do you like more, Gary Johnson or Ron Paul?" "Ron Paul, of course." "Me too. Do you prefer Cato or the Mises Institute?" "The Mises Institute." "Me too. Are you an anarchist or a minarchist?" "I'm an anarchist." "Me too. Are you an anarcho-capitalist or an agorist?" "Anarcho-capitalist." "Me too. Are you a consequentialist anarcho-capitalist or a deontological natural rights anarcho-capitalist?" "Deontological." "Me too. Are you a Rothbardian or a Hoppian?" "Rothbardian." "Wow, me too. It seems like you and I have a lot in common," the jogger says. "Now, answer me this one last question. You being a fellow Rothbardian and all, do you prefer early 1970s for New Liberty era Rothbard or later post-1990 Paleocon Rothbard?" "That's a tough question," the man replies. "I like them both, but if I absolutely had to choose, I'd say my politics are probably closer to those of early Rothbard." Suddenly, the jogger's expression changes, and for the next few seconds, he just stares at the man angrily. And then, without the slightest bit of hesitation, the jogger proceeds to shove the other man off the edge. And as he watches as the other man plunges downwards into the briny waters below, the jogger shakes his head in disappointment, and then, letting out a deep sigh, he mutters to himself, "Fucking Lolbert." As the classic adage goes, if you were to take 10 libertarians and then put them all into a room together, you would end up getting 11 different opinions. As a matter of fact, it sometimes seems like they fight more amongst themselves than they do against the people on the left and the people on the right. No ideology is monolithic, least of all that of libertarians. Standing beneath liberty's ideological umbrella are an eclectic assortment of various subgroups, factions, and philosophies, few of which are in agreement with one another on issues other than the most rudimentary, and the contraries between them all is enough to make one question if sharing a common label is even useful. This, in turn, has a tendency to create even more problems. Internally, libertarians are often quick to recognize the different flavors of their ideology, and which individuals belong to which. But from the outside, it is far more difficult to notice these distinctions, or even any distinction at all. Mainstream media is perhaps most guilty of this, and to anyone who is familiar with the precepts of libertarian philosophy, this may be quite evident. In those rare instances during which the mainstream media even brings up libertarianism, they often make sweeping generalizations, the most embarrassing of which being the tendency of the news anchors and journalists to invoke the Libertarian Party as being the ideological arbiter of libertarian itself as a broader political tradition and movement, even though over half of American libertarians are not registered members of the Libertarian Party. Even more bizarre, is how those who belong to other ideological constituencies often tend to characterize libertarians. Depending on the poll, somewhere between roughly 10% and 22% of Americans describe themselves as either libertarian or libertarian-leaning. Yet despite the moderate popularity of libertarian ideas, it all too often feels like most Americans have not even the slightest clue of what its ideology entails, and thus are prone to ascribe their own arbitrary definitions and classifications to it. Go ask any Republican who is not Rand Paul, or any Democrat who is not the governor of Colorado, to describe what libertarians believe, and they're liable to characterize them as Ayn Rand-worshipping whack jobs and conspiracy theorists who want bears to drive and think that babies should own firearms. Both sides have a consistent habit of mischaracterizing their ideology. Leftists have a tendency to characterize libertarianism as some kind of a far-right ideology, simply due to the fact that they're opposed to socialism and high government spending. On the other hand, right-wing conservatives tend to view libertarians as just a bunch of anti-war hippies who want to cut military spending in order to help the US's enemies. To Democrats, they're just Republicans who smoke weed. To Republicans, they're just Democrats for lower taxes. And even members on the dissident right, such as neo-reactionaries, who are in many ways natural strategic allies to libertarians, as being a form of leftism. None of these characterizations are in any way accurate. There is also a common perception, most often held by political moderates, that libertarianism means socially liberal and fiscally conservative. And while this is frequently the case, the synthesis of social liberalism with fiscal conservatism is not so much as even a secondary maxim within the broader framework of libertarian philosophy. To that end, it seems almost ridiculous that so many Americans are unable to properly define and distinguish the different types of libertarianism that exist. This video is to be the first in a series in which I will be discussing what I consider to be the 10 major strands of modern libertarianism. Originally, I had planned on making this a single video, but as I continued to write the scripts, it quickly became evident that the level of analysis required in undergoing such a detailed examination would be far too substantial to be able to cover over the course of a single video. Therefore, I decided that it would be best to break it up into 3 separate parts, with each one focusing on a different ideological family of libertarianism within its wider philosophical taxonomy. In this video, we will be examining the 3 strands of American libertarianism which I would regard and classify as being the 3 mainline branches, with the 2 subsequent installations of the series centering around the more niche variants of the overall ideology. And as a final disclaimer, this series is intended to be a dispassionate study wherein the purpose is to detail, dissect, compare and contrast the various traditions that comprise the liberty movements, particularly in the US context. Thus, do not expect any sort of an ideological manifesto advocating my own personal ideological suppositions. Rather, my intention is to present a detailed illustration of all branches contained within the totality of modern libertarian thought, and to do so in a fashion that is strictly informative and free of any political bias. Hopefully this series, beginning with this video, will prove to be a helpful and engaging source of information that may be of good use to those who seek to better understand libertarian ideas, their history, and the countless different interpretations of and approaches to libertarianism as a political, economic, and ethical framework. At its most basic, classical liberalism may be summed up as an ideology that values the importance of private property, free trade, the rule of law, constitutionalism, and individual freedom. While today generally viewed as a subset of libertarianism, classical liberalism, originally simply called liberalism, predates modern libertarianism by a good couple hundred years, having its roots in the early days of the Enlightenment during the 17th century, most notably within the political thought of philosophers such as John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. Eventually, by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it made way for other, less libertarian variants of liberalism as well, such as social liberalism, social democracy, and constitutional conservatism. The precursor to the modern libertarian movement, particularly in the United States, was founded, for the lack of a better term, by various 20th century intellectuals who subscribed to traditional liberalism and sought to revitalize this free market tradition, such being a reaction to its waning popularity amidst the rising prominence of newer strains of liberalism which tended to favor larger government and increased regulation over the market. The term libertarian itself, which had previously been associated more so with European anarchists, but had since largely fallen out of use, was adopted by some of these stalwarts in the United States around the 1940s and 50s, in order so that they could distinguish themselves from those who adhered to modern quote-unquote liberalism. Although in Europe, the word liberal has more or less retained its original meaning. The other strains of libertarianism that we will be discussing in this video took shape shortly thereafter, as modifications and/or philosophical and ideological alternatives to the more mainstream classical liberalism. In the context of modern libertarianism, classical liberals refer to those whose political beliefs tend to align philosophically with the thinkers of the Enlightenment, such as the Founding Fathers. Among these classical liberals, most are likely to take the decentralist states' rights view championed by Thomas Jefferson, although there are many who also adhere to the more federalist approach favored by James Madison. A firm belief in republicanism, or representative democracy, is a defining feature in modern classical liberalism, as well as a dedication to the upholding of individual rights. Perhaps most distinguishable among modern classical liberals is an emphatic concern for commerce and a concentrated focus on economic theory. A staunch belief in economic liberalism is the feature that has most fundamentally defined classical liberalism since Adam Smith. And today's classical liberals will often either subscribe to one of two camps: that of the neoclassical Chicago school, advanced by thinkers such as Milton Friedman, George Stigler, Gary Becker, Jim Buchanan, and Walter Williams, or the laissez-faire Austrian school, among whose ranks have included economists Henry Hazlitt, Ludwig von Mises, and Friedrich A. Hayek. Although the belief in free markets is a feature that is commonly shared by all major strands of contemporary libertarianism, today's classical liberals especially emphasize upon its importance. To them, it is the central ideological nucleus of liberty itself. Among each of the strains of libertarian capitalism, classical liberalism is the one that is most favorable towards the existence of the state. Though nonetheless defined by skepticism towards state power, today's classical liberals, like their Enlightenment forebears, tend to view government as being, at the very least, a necessary evil. As they see it, it is not the state itself that is necessarily the problem, but big government. A classical liberal would therefore rather see the state reduced as opposed to abolished altogether. However, what constitutes as limited government varies in range from liberal to liberal, especially when it comes to issues regarding social programs, regulation, executive power, and taxes. While nearly the majority of classical liberals today are likely to be favorable towards things like a social safety net, government involvement in education, compulsory taxation, and the legalization or decriminalization of recreational drugs, they'll tend to differ on the finer details. For example, on the question of welfare, you might have one who supports a limited, albeit robust, welfare state consisting of a number of select programs, whereas another may be more inclined to support something akin to universal basic income, either in the form of a negative income tax or a flat dividend. While many oppose any form of government healthcare whatsoever, particularly in the US, some might support a public subsidy of some kind, or, in some rare cases even, socialized medicine. Some classical liberals oppose all forms of public education in favor of school vouchers and/or charter schools, while others believe in having all three available as options. Where some might be for a flat tax, others will be for a low progressive tax, or perhaps even just a single uniform national sales tax. Regardless, modern classical liberals stand out among most other libertarians in their belief that the state possesses a certain degree of utility and can thus be used to advance the cause of liberty so long as it is kept in check. Some figures today, who would probably be best characterized as classical liberals, would be former U.S. House Representative Justin Amash, 2016 Libertarian Party presidential candidate Gary Johnson, economist Thomas Sowell, consumer journalist and television personality John Stossel, Canadian politician Maxime Bernier, or even, in some regards, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
Do you regret your comment?
There is a significant overlap between classical liberalism and other non-anarchist forms of libertarianism. But those who today primarily identify with the label often tend to adhere to a variant that is far more moderate than most of the others we will be discussing going forward. For me, This is the type of libertarianism to which I would probably be closest aligned, although I have personally come to prefer the term national liberal over classical liberal as a label that I would use to most accurately describe myself and my beliefs, as I strongly veer much closer towards nationalism than I do towards universalism. To that end, classical liberalism is fairly fluid as an ideology and is not defined by any strictly specific philosophical or policy prescriptions. Instead, what defines classical liberals is a common adherence to the core tenets of free market economics and to the political, moral, and overall philosophical tradition of the Enlightenment. Accurately perceived as being the most radical variant of libertarianism, anarcho-capitalism refers to a broad range of philosophies that advocate for the total abolition of the state and the subsequent privatization of all government services. The ideology was first conceived by historian and Austrian economist Murray N. Rothbard, widely hailed as the most important libertarian theorist of the 20th century, who viewed the classical liberalism of his mentor Ludwig von Mises as being insufficient in ensuring the establishment and long-term perpetuation of a true libertarian society. Drawing from the traditions of classical liberalism, individualist anarchism, the Austrian School of Economics, and the anti-imperialist movements of the early 20th century, Rothbard synthesized these various ideas and principles in order to form a coherent political philosophy that would eventually grow into what is now known as anarcho-capitalism, the framework of which he laid out in his 1973 magnum opus, For a New Liberty. In the book, he argues against the classical liberal notion of limited government, taking the position that any form of state power is detrimental to individual and economic liberty, both of which are fundamentally inseparable from one another. Herein Rothbard presents a compelling case for radical decentralization and privatization, asserting that each and every public function, including the military, would be better handled by the private sector. At the heart of anarcho-capitalist philosophy is the idea of the non-aggression principle, which, in the tradition of Thomas Jefferson and John Stuart Mill, states that it is immoral to initiate force, and that the only ethical justification through which one may engage in acts of violence is that of self-defense. While most libertarians adhere to some form of this principle or another, the anarcho-capitalist interpretation of the NAP extends to any and all forms of coercion, no matter the perpetrator. The anarcho-capitalists, the state's violation of the NAP is indicative in its power to arbitrarily collect taxes and its ability to wage unjust wars. For many ANCAPs, anarcho-capitalism is more of a philosophical position as opposed to a strict civic ideology, something of an ideal rather than a practical system. This is why a good many ANCAPs are functionally classical liberals, yet seek to peacefully shrink government power as much as possible or pursue efforts to privatize the state itself. Although most ANCAPs seem to take Rothbard's natural rights approach in arguing for a libertarian society, some take a more consequentialist position on the issue, such as Dr. David Friedman. Like Friedman, these ANCAPs often tend to prefer a neoclassical Chicago school approach to free market economics, as opposed to the traditional Austrian methodology. Other than Friedman, some prominent ANCAPs today are Robert Murphy, Walter Block, and Jeff Deist, all of whom serve as fellows at the Ludwig von Mises Institute, which is itself the leading organization advocating anarcho-capitalist ideas. Although radical in nature, anarcho-capitalism represents the most principled, logical extreme to which the libertarian ideology is capable of stretching, and its adherents remain some of the most vocal activists within the wider liberty movement. Standing as what is possibly the most common form of libertarianism in the United States, minarchism is the second major strain of libertarian thought to emerge during the 1970s, and the liberty movement was still in its infancy. As far as terminology goes, the word minarchist can often be heard to mean one of two things. In its more colloquial form, the label is used as a catch-all term to simply designate any libertarian who believes in the existence of a state, in order to distinguish them from anarchists. More formally, minarchism refers to a distinct ideological strand of libertarianism that can perhaps be best summed up as a sort of middle ground between classical liberalism and anarchism. When the subject of libertarianism is brought up by the average person, minarchism will likely be what comes to mind, even though the term itself is hardly used outside of libertarian circles. The conceptual origins of minarchism can be directly traced back to the writings of American philosopher Robert Nozick, specifically his 1974 book Anarchy, State, and Utopia, which was initially written as a response to John Rawls's A Theory of Justice. A classical liberal to the bone, Nozick refuted Rawls's notion that the moral role of the state is to actively distribute justice and provide citizens with the greatest level of material prosperity capable of being attained, instead countering that people are happier, more prosperous, and all around better off when the government does not interfere in their lives. Thus, according to Nozick, the moral prerogative of the state would be to uphold the rule of law via the provision of three core public services: law enforcement, legal courts, and national defense. Nozick saw the allure of anarchism, and even sympathized with many of the same ideas espoused by Murray Rothbard, but also recognized what he saw as the inherent paradox of anarchy, the simple fact that, in a stateless society, there would exist nothing to prevent a state from forming, and, of course, the only force capable of preventing the formation of a state would be, by definition, another state. Therefore, Nozick viewed anarchy as utopia, ideal but impractical. While anarchism may have been libertarianism at its most logical extreme, Nozick's minarchism would be its most reasonable extreme. All minarchists are typified by a desire to establish what is known as a night watchman or minimal state, much like the one advocated for by the British liberals of the 19th century. In a night watchman state, the government will provide only a handful of public utilities, such as police, emergency services, standing military, and a court system to enforce property rights, with everything else left up to the private sector. This is the framework that defines minarchism as a distinct philosophy, although individual minarchists will often have different ideas on how these functions would operate and be publicly funded. As such, minarchism and classical liberalism are not necessarily mutually exclusive to one another, as minarchism presents what is essentially the most limited form of a classically liberal state. Thus, many minarchists will also identify as classical liberals and vice versa. However, it should be said that the majority of self-described classical liberals will typically advocate for something a bit larger and more robust than the more radical Nozickian night watchman state promoted by minarchists, which is why it is best to distinguish minarchists from standard classical liberals. The majority of American libertarians would likely fall under the label of minarchist, even though most would probably not claim that specific label. Minarchists could be best divided into two different categories: ideological and practical. An ideological minarchist would be a libertarian who believes that a limited night watchman state is itself the ideal and should be the goal to work towards. Two fine examples of this would be foreign policy expert Scott Horton or comedian Dave Smith. Practical minarchists, on the other hand, are most often philosophical anarchists who believe that establishing a limited state would be the most effective means through which to advance the virtues of voluntarism. A good example of this would be someone like Tom Woods, who, while an anarchist in the moral and philosophical sense, is a self-described Jeffersonian Democrat. But perhaps the most prominent minarchist of recent years, if not the most famous libertarian alive today, is former U.S. House Representative and presidential candidate Ron Paul, who advocates for a night watchman state governed on the basis of the United States Constitution. Again, minarchists probably make up the largest individual percentage of libertarians, even if most do not explicitly embrace that particular label. Nonetheless, they remain the face of the libertarian movement to this day, and thus represent the most principled middle ground between classical liberalism and anarchism. As is the case with most political movements, libertarianism, despite being only a minority persuasion in the greater scheme of things, remains a deeply robust and ideologically diverse tradition within the realm of America's overarching political dialogue. But due to its holding only secondary significance and very little influence within US politics, let alone that of other countries, libertarianism suffers from being all too often overlooked by both politicians and the media alike, which has the unfortunate consequence of giving the impression to those who are uninitiated in the ways of political theory, in that it is an irrelevant ideology, and therefore unworthy of any kind of serious consideration. And when the ideology does come up in the mainstream media, it is often treated as if it were either some kind of a fringe, a typical faction of anti-government activists, or, even more reductively, as a single uniform philosophy, which, as I hope this video has made clear, could not be any further from the truth. In fact, there is actually a case to be made that libertarianism is among one of the most ideologically diverse political movements in the contemporary civic discourse, down to every last individual. Classical liberalism, anarcho-capitalism, and minarchism are only three among many ideological strands of libertarianism that exist today, and they represent what are merely the most mainstream, garden varieties of thought within the wider liberty movement. And as for those other distinct variants, they will be the subject of upcoming videos. But as for now, it is important that we remember, regardless of the ideology's marginal status within the modern political discourse, that libertarianism is among the oldest of all of America's political traditions, and is, philosophically speaking, the ethos whose ideals most closely resemble those upon which the United States was first established. Thank you for watching. Please be sure to like and subscribe, and always remember, the only freedom which deserves to be called such is that of pursuing our own individual good in our own individual way.